in Massachusetts. I am a senior, so this is my last semester. I am a history minor, which is what pertains to this. But in regards to my major, I am a government major with a concentration in American politics. And I one day wish to have a mustache as good as yours, as you can see.
Well, Sean, I have to tell you, I grew up in Malden.
Oh, nice.
Oh, yeah. Went to the BB school.
Oh, very nice, very nice.
All right. Well, thank you, Sean, very much. Who's next? Sarah, please. You're muted.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Sarah. I am also a senior, so this is my last semester. I am an economics major and a history minor, and I'm from Connecticut.
All right. Well, welcome, Sarah.
Thank
and who? Ray Levin, please.
Hello. My
Good
name
morning.
is Levin. I am from Chestnut Hill, and I am a junior, and I am a history major.
All right.
And I'm probably going to specialize in maritime history.
Well, good for you.
Thanks.
It'll be you and me, Ray. Okay.
You're a maritime history specialist.
I am. I love it.
And Ray, he has written a couple of books about your favorite kinds of vessels.
I was going to
Ray
say,
loves
does
big.
he, Professor Fowler, I see that picture behind you. Is that the Queen Mary?
Queen Mary, yes, it is. That's the Queen Mary 1.
Yes, the Queen Mary 2 has only one funnel.
That's correct. I have sailed on the Queen Mary 2 now about 24 times. Beautiful ship.
Mm-hmm. But is your specialty liners, sir?
I'm sorry?
Your specialty liners.
Well, no, not really. Actually, to be honest with you, Ray, I know more about the age of sail than I do about steel and steam. But given the 20th century, I sail on steam. Just not to delay this, but for the last 30 or 35 years, I guess, I've worked on cruise ships. So I've sailed on the Queen Mary 2 and lots of ships all over the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, down to South America. So
Wow.
see, now if you're a maritime historian, you might be able to get a gig like I have, lecturing on cruise ships. Good. It's a good gig, a real good gig.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to meet you, Ray.
Of course, thank you.
Oh, Megan, tell me about yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Megan, and I'm a freshman, and I am a law major and a history minor.
Where are you from, Megan?
I'm from Rehoboth, Massachusetts.
Oh,
No.
down in the southern part of the Commonwealth, huh?
Yeah, no one really ever knows it, so.
Yeah, well, I know where it is. I think I've even been there once or twice, but good. Glad you're here. And Mike, I can't see you, but I guess you're with us, aren't you?
Yes, I am. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm fine. How are you doing, Mike?
I'm doing
there you
well.
are.
I'm a computer science major with a history minor.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Hold on one second. Currently, I live in Brighton, Massachusetts. And yeah, I'm just, doing my best with this online semester stuff.
Oh, well, I know. Well, listen, Mike, if something goes wrong, since you're a computer major, I'll expect you to fix it, right?
Sounds great. I'm here for you.
All right.
Whatever you need.
Okay. And Trevor. Can you hear me, Trevor? Or maybe not. All right. Mike DeAngelis.
Yeah,
I think that was Mike. So Mike
Oh,
Ford
okay.
is next.
Sorry,
Mike Ford.
sorry.
I'm sorry, Mike Ford.
Good, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
So I guess, I'm a senior at Suffolk, criminal justice major, and I work at BMC, Boston Medical Center.
Oh, you do?
Yep.
A busy place, Mike. A very
Very
busy
busy.
place. Well, good. Glad you're here. Now, did I get everyone?
Trevor.
Yeah. Are you there, Trevor? I don't know.
Trevor, everyone's introducing themselves. So could you do that?
Can you hear me, Trevor? I don't think Trevor can hear me.
No. Oh, there he goes. Okay, so
there we go.
there you
So
go.
who are you, Trevor? All right, go ahead. Tell me about yourself, please.
I'm Trevor Rafferty. I'm a junior at Suffolk. I'm a politics, philosophy, and economics major with a minor in history.
Mm-hmm. And where are you from, Trevor?
I'm from Uxbridge, Massachusetts.
Oh my gosh, we're all over the Commonwealth, are we? Now we're out to the mid part of the Commonwealth. Well, good. I'm glad you're here too. So Professor Allison is going to assist me. He's going to be my teaching assistant for this class. So he's going to press the magic button and use the slides. So as I go forward, by the way, if you have any questions or any comments or anything, just raise your hand. I can see you all. I can see most of you on screen. And so if I can see you on screen and I see your hand raised, I'll acknowledge you. So let's begin. The first slide, of course, is a self-promotion. I want you to run to the bookstore and buy it. But in any case, so Bob, can we go to the first slide, if we could, please? Well, I think you know the general outlines of the American Civil War. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 precipitated the secession of southern states. The first state to leave was South Carolina, and she left in December 20th, 1860. And then by February of 1861, 6 other states had left as well. And so the Confederacy then was formed. As the Confederacy was formed, first its capital was in Montgomery, Alabama, but then they moved the capital to Richmond, Virginia. The government, the federal government under the time, was under President Buchanan. Buchanan was a great and tremendous failure. And what happened in the interim between December and February of 1861 is that Buchanan ordered Union forces withdrawn from the South. And the Union forces, forts were abandoned, and Union soldiers, when a lot of them, came home to the North. Many Union officers, and I say Union in quotation marks, remained South. That is, many Union officers resigned from the American Army and joined the Confederate forces. As the Union withdrew from the South, though, there were 2 forts that remained in possession of the Union. One was Fort Pickens, and Fort Pickens was off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. It was several miles out in the Gulf of Mexico, so it was somewhat secure. The Confederates really couldn't get at it. So Fort Pickens was just isolated but secure. Then the other fort was Fort Sumter, which was smack in the middle of Charleston, South Carolina's harbor. The slide you see on the screen today is a map, a chart of the harbor of Charleston. I hope you can see it. It's a little small, but as you can see, the entrance to the harbor, that section there in the middle, is very narrow. It's narrow and relatively shallow. On either side of the entrance of that harbor, the Confederates had established forts. There, if you go into the harbor, right smack in the middle of the harbor, almost directly in the middle of the harbor, was a small little island, and on that island was Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter is in the middle of Charleston Harbor. If you go further to the left, you see that peninsula coming down. That is the city of Charleston, South Carolina. Well, the Confederates immediately demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. The Army officer in command was Major Robert Anderson. Anderson had a very small force. He couldn't possibly defend the fort against the Confederates. Nonetheless, he tried his best. On the 12th of April, 1861, the Confederates opened fire from the Charleston batteries, opened fire on Fort Sumter. But the barrage lasted less than a day, and Major Anderson was forced to surrender. The slide you see there is the interior of Fort Sumter, the casement as it was called, and you can see the Union forces trying to return Confederate fire with very little success. Next slide, Bob, please. Yes, yeah, the next one, please, Bob. Thank you. And here you see Major Anderson standing there at the left, and the Union artillerymen returning the fire at Fort Sumter, more in a symbolic gesture than anything else. And so Fort Sumter then was abandoned. Lincoln ordered its abandonment. The abandonment of Fort Sumter then put the Confederates in charge, with the exception of Fort Pickens, which was really sort of a minor place, put the Confederates in charge of the entire southern coast. Next slide, please, Bob. Here you see the United States, and what I'm talking about, the southern coast, it runs roughly from Virginia, Chesapeake Bay, all the way down the coast around Florida, all the way to the Mexican border. That was the coast of the Confederate States of America. As the war began, as most wars in the early stages, everyone thought it would be over early. You know, the boys will be home by Christmas, sort of thing. The Confederates thought they'd whip those Yankee rascals in a single battle. And the Union Army marched with the singing out, "On to Richmond, on to Richmond." Well, didn't turn out quite that way. Lincoln initially called for 75,000 volunteers. by the end of the war, the Union Army would mass millions of men. The optimism was ill-founded, but it was traditional. And so because they thought the war would be over very quickly, and that the Union or the Confederacy would win, either taking Washington or Richmond, there was one person who disagreed. His name was General Winfield Scott. General Scott was an old man when the war began. He had been a hero of the War of 1812, been around a long time. General Scott didn't think the war would be a quick one, and so he proposed a plan, a strategy to President Lincoln. Could we have the next slide, Bob? And what General Winfield Scott proposed, the next slide, Bob, was to put a barricade around the entire South, a blockade. And that Scott's idea was we would blockade the South and then squeeze it. Everybody derided Winfield Scott's idea. They thought it was silly, they thought it was wasteful, and it wouldn't be necessary. And so the newspapermen referred to it as the Anaconda Plan, the great snake. And here you see a political cartoon. And that's what it shows, that anaconda snake surrounding and then squeezing the South. And again, it was dismissed. No one thought this was be necessary. The Confederacy could be whipped in an afternoon. Well, that wasn't the case, of course. And ironically, Winfield Scott's plan, which everyone derided in 1861, became, as the war dragged on, the Union strategy. That the strategy of the Union was to surround the Confederacy and squeeze it, and squeeze it. Next slide, Bob, please. The U.S. Navy would be a critical factor because it would be the Navy that would in fact be in charge of blockading the coast. One of the strategies, an important strategy of the Union, was to be certain that they were able to isolate the Confederacy from any assistance from abroad. A slight bit of international law here. A nation at war can declare a blockade against another nation, but in order for that blockade to be recognized in international law, it must be effective. So while Lincoln could declare a blockade of the South, unless he could enforce it, foreign nations could ignore it. And that would be very dangerous because it would mean that foreign nations could supply the previous slide, Bob, the one that shows the Cape Hatteras forts. It would be dangerous if the blockade didn't work. Foreign nations could give diplomatic recognition, bad idea for the Union, and also could supply it with arms. And so it became necessary not only to declare the blockade, but to enforce the blockade. Now, in this matter, Lincoln had a real problem. At the time, 1861, the entire U.S. Navy numbered about 60 ships, only 60. Of that number, only 40 were in service. And of that number of 40, only 12 were in the home squadron. That is to say, the major part of the American Navy, the vessels in the American Navy, were in distant ports. They were patrolling the African coast, they were in the Pacific, they were in the Mediterranean, they were somewhere in the North Atlantic. So Lincoln had a real problem in rallying, bringing those ships home, and then getting more ships. Now, in any blockade, and this is true of the Civil War, it's true of any war, really, blockades are always difficult to maintain. It's just very hard to effectively blockade a coast. The best way to blockade an enemy is to seize the ports. That would be the best thing to do. If you can seize the enemy ports, then the blockade is completely effective. And so in the summer of 1861, the American Navy began to take and attack Confederate forts. Here you see a slide that shows really the first amphibious operation, one of the first amphibious operations of the U.S. Navy. They're going ashore at the Hatteras forts. This is off the coast of North Carolina. It's August of 1861. And there on the left part of the slide, you can see Union frigates. And by the way, you can see they're sailing vessels, but they have funnels, so they're steam powered as well, a combination of steam and sail. They're laying down fire against the Hatteras forts. And in the meantime, down the lower portion of this painting, you can see boats pulling for shore. Those are the Marines and the Army ready to perform an amphibious operation against the Hatteras forts. Union Navy managed to take the Hatteras forts, which made it very difficult for the North Carolinians, that portion of the southern coast, to open their ports. The next slide, Bob, please. Now, this is also a time of a change in technology. This is getting in the latter part of the 19th century. Steam is taking over. And at this time, it is the transition moment. That is to say, vessels are steam powered, but they still have sails. Steam isn't entirely reliable, and steam is expensive. And furthermore, you can't carry a lot of coal. These are all coal fired. Difficult to carry enough coal to have any range. So sail was an important auxiliary. The other technology that was changing too was iron, armored ships. By 1861, they were still very, very, very new. There were only two operational armored warships. One, the French had built in 1859, the Glory. And then in 1860, the British had launched their own armored vessel called the Warrior. By the way, just as a little footnote, the Warrior today is an historic vessel, and she's at Portsmouth, England. It is open for visitors. But the point is, armored vessels were there, but they weren't very reliable, and people were very certain of them. But they had to have steam vessels, because the steam vessels were the only vessels that could effectively blockade and catch vessels, Confederate vessels, trying to run in and out. Here you see the steamer DeSoto. Nothing special about her, by the way, nothing special at all, except that she's typical of the kind of vessels that the Union Navy, that Lincoln and the Union Navy either built or chartered. They rented a lot of vessels. They needed, by the end of the Civil War, the American Navy numbered around 600 vessels. It was a huge, huge Navy. Beginning with 60, they meant the 600. But of those 600, many, many, many were chartered vessels. The DeSoto was a merchant vessel that the Navy chartered. And you can see, typical of her time, she's a wooden vessel, not armored, steam, she has sails, and she's side-wheeled. If you look right at the midsection of that vessel, you see that thing that comes out over the side. That's a side wheel. That's on the starboard side. On the opposite side is another wheel. And so side wheelers were quite common. Some propeller-driven vessels, that is propellers under the stern of the vessel, but not a lot. Propeller-driven were also, at this moment, fairly new as well. So most were side wheelers. We do the next slide, please, Bob. Well, the blockade in the early days didn't work very well. And this again is another newspaper cartoon that appeared. It's called The Blockade on the Connecticut Plan. The Connecticut Plan was a reference to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. Gideon Welles came from Connecticut, and he was in charge of running the blockade. And in the early days, he didn't do a very good job. And what you see here on the left and on the right are two Union blockading vessels. And there in the middle, steaming away, is the Confederate Raider. We'll talk about her a little bit later. The Confederate Raider Nashville. And what you see here is the vessel, the Union vessel on the left and the Union vessel on the right, hopelessly trying to catch up with that fast Confederate Raider steaming off over the horizon. So the blockade then was pretty much derided. It becomes much more effective during the war. But I must caution you that even towards the very end of the war, 1865, a lot of Confederate vessels were still making runs. Confederate Raiders, Confederate blockade runners, by the way, were still making runs into Confederate ports that were still in Confederate hands. They would sail at night, no moon and the darkness, kind of a low vessel, low silhouette, and they would come running in. They would come in from Bermuda. The way the Confederates operated this is that vessels would come from Europe to Bermuda, a place like Hamilton, and there in Bermuda, Confederate blockade runners would pick up the supplies and then run as fast as they could into the Confederate ports. Again, just as a little footnote, you may know this, perhaps the most famous Confederate captain of a blockade runner was a fictional character whose name was Rhett Butler. If you remember Gone with the Wind, Rhett Butler, who is the central character, Clark Gable, is in fact a Confederate blockade runner captain. So it was a pretty romantic business. And again, right up until the end of the war, they were still having some success. So the blockade was never completely effective. Next slide, please, Bob. Now, I mentioned taking the ports. That's how you made the blockade effective. And in November of 1861, a Union squadron was sent to Port Royal, South Carolina, to take Port Royal. And here you see the Union vessels, and there's a frigate there in the beginning. You can see her firing the guns. What they decided, what the Union Navy used as a tactic, was to sail in front of a fort in kind of an egg shape, so that you had this line of Union vessels constantly making a kind of circle, a long elliptical circle in front of the fort. And you can see the vessel would come by, the Union vessel would come by, lay out her guns, bombard the fort, then turn, come around, the vessel behind her would repeat. And this was a constant, keep up a constant fire against the forts at Port Royal. They managed to take Port Royal with the amphibious force. One of the things they discovered, though, is that in the southern forts, so many of them were built with sand or palmetto logs. Palmetto logs are a very soft wood that the Union shot, and this was solid cast iron balls that weighed 20, 30, some of them 100 pounds, that they would hit the sand and just go shmush, or hit the palmetto log and just go shmush. So they weren't terribly effective. Again, it's another technology that is emerging. We're going to move from solid shot to exploding shot. But during the time of the Civil War, exploding shot was still so very new. It wasn't altogether reliable. So it's exploding shot sometimes worked, sometimes didn't, but it was that solid cannonball. It wasn't very effective against sand and palmetto logs. But they did manage in November of 1861 to take Port Royal. That was important because it now gave the Union blockading force a base from which to operate. Think for a moment, again, the logistics of the 1860s, they tried to maintain a blockading fleet off the coast was very difficult. They'd run out of food, they'd run out of coal, they'd constantly be having to come back to New York or Boston. But now, if you had a position at Port Royal in South Carolina, that became an important base for the Union Navy to blockade the coast along the Carolinas and down to the south. So the blockade is becoming ever more effective, ever more effective. Now, as I mentioned, though, the Confederacy wanted to break the blockade to get both supplies and to get recognition. The Confederacy never had the capacity to build a navy. Go to the next slide, please, Bob. Building a navy requires an industrial base, and the Confederacy simply didn't have that industrial base. They did in the very early days of the war, right after in the spring of 1861, the Confederate forces did manage to capture the Union Navy base at Norfolk, Virginia. Here in this slide, if you look to a little bit to the left at the bottom of the image, is the Norfolk Naval Base. And the Confederates took the Norfolk Naval Base. The Union Navy failed miserably to destroy the materials that were left behind. They left behind a hoard of material for the Confederates. Among the things they left behind was the Union frigate Merrimack.
Excuse me, Professor Fowler, I think we have a question from.
Oh, sure, go right ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
The Merrimack.
Yes.
She became the ironclad Virginia, didn't she?
She sure did.
I was about to ask, when is that going to come in? The ironclad.
Right now. And among the things they found at the Norfolk Navy Yard was the Union frigate, steam frigate Merrimack, which the Union Navy had scuttled, but they didn't do a very good job of it. And the Confederate forces raised the Merrimack, okay, and cut her down, cut the masts off, and put iron over her, just iron over her, and renamed her the CSS Virginia. And they mounted guns, starboard and port, forward and aft, and she was steam powered. Next slide, please. And so the Merrimack, now known as the CSS Virginia, steamed out of Norfolk into the area of Hampton Roads in March 8th. Can we get that, Bob? Next one.
I think Professor Allison is muted.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, a question from Sean.
Oh, go ahead, Sean.
So you mentioned at the start of the Civil War, the Union only had like 60 ships.
That's right.
You also
That's right.
said that the South didn't really have like a very strong like industrial base to like
No,
build
no,
them.
no,
So
they didn't.
were most of their ships just like what used to be Union ships, but like when the state seceded, they kind of seized them?
Uh, Not many. Well, the Merrimack is an exception, obviously, but she was a scout. What the South did was to build small vessels. They never built very. They built some ironclads. They built ironclads in Selma, Alabama, and in other places. But the problem with building ironclads is they didn't have much iron, and so they'd often, and this is an example of a self-defeating measure. They would tear up railroads. Railroad iron was available, but as they tore up the rails for ironclads, of course, they were hampering themselves in transportation in terms of the of their own internal transportation. There was an ironworks in Richmond called the Tredegar Iron Works, and they made iron there. But they never made, they couldn't make much. There just wasn't an industrial base for the Confederacy to, the same thing, by the way, for cannon. They could make some cannon, but most of the cannon they got was from abroad or cannon they had seized in the early days of the war. That was one of the principal weaknesses of the Confederacy, was a lack of an industrial base. Good question, good question. So the CSS Virginia now, okay, the Virginia, no longer the Merrimack, sorties out into Hampton Roads, that large body of water at the opening there at Chesapeake Bay. And there on March 8th, the Virginia came out, attacked the Union blockading force, and sank the Cumberland, the US frigate Cumberland. And here, that's what you see here, the Cumberland going down. This was a shock. This is the first time in history that an ironclad has in fact engaged in combat and sank a Confederate, or sank an enemy vessel. She sank the Cumberland, but the Merrimack, the Virginia, had mechanical problems. She wasn't, she had been built from a vessel that had been sunk, so she had certain weaknesses. After destroying the Cumberland, the Virginia returned to port. And the expectation was, of course, the next day she'd sail back out and destroy the rest of the Union fleet. Next slide, Bob, please. But the Union had not been inactive in all of this. Very early in the war, a Swedish inventor named John Erickson, a man very well known, by the way, he had helped design the propeller. He was known in American naval circles. John Erickson came to the US Navy with a proposal to build an ironclad. It was a radical design that he proposed. What he proposed was a vessel that was relatively flat with right in the middle a turret. Someone deridingly referred to it as a cheese box on a raft. It looked like a circular cheese box just set on a raft. And again, it was one of those moments when the old hands in the Navy said, no, 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 no. Abraham Lincoln, in one of his great anecdotes, mentioned them as, he said, seems to me this is like when the man put his leg into his pants. He said, must be something in it. And so it was Lincoln who said, no, let's try Erickson's plan. And the plan, then the construction began in New York. She was built in New York. Erickson recommended, there were all kinds of names that were suggested for this vessel, but Erickson suggested, let's call her Monitor, because she is going to monitor the South. Monitor it became. And providentially, one can think of things that happened. On the 8th of March, the Virginia had sailed out, then went back. The very next day, March 9th, the Monitor arrived on the scene. And so when Virginia came out on the second day, there she was met by the Monitor in a battle. And it was a rousing battle. It went on for hours. And you can imagine what it was like for a minute. Let me just suggest to you something kind of in a social history way, that the men who served in the American Navy up until this time served in vessels, even if they were steam vessels, they're on the deck, they're in the rigging, they felt the kick of the wheel and the wind, and except they could see the ocean. It was an experience, which any of you have been to see, it's a wonderful experience to stand on the deck. That was not the experience here. These men, both on the Virginia and on the Monitor, are down inside iron boxes. It's metal, it's awful, it's hell. Temperature in the monitor could go up to 120 degrees down below. There was very little ventilation. The noise, you can imagine these 50-pound cannonballs hitting the sides of these vessels. They bounced off, that's true, but the reverberations inside were tremendous. This was a new kind of battle. Terrible, terrible. Well, it ended more or less in a draw. Towards the end of the day, the Virginia withdrew, and so too did the Monitor withdraw. So there was, in this battle, no victor. Next slide, Bob, please. But the challenge that the Virginia had was she was very deep draft, and they tried to get her up the James River to security, but she couldn't make it very far. They knew that she was going to be vulnerable. The Union was going to come back. And so here you see, May 11th, 1862, the Confederates scuttled. They blew up the Virginia because they could not save her. But nonetheless, Virginia and Monitor had ushered in now this new age of armed naval warfare. Next slide, Bob, please. Now, of course, these ports, now that the Hampton Roads was more or less blockaded, Charleston was blockaded, but not so very well. Next, the Union moved down to Savannah. This is a map, a contemporary map of Savannah. The city of Savannah, which you can see at the top there, that dark area, is up several miles up the Savannah River. And it was the Union desire to capture Savannah, but that's going to be very difficult. Next slide, please, Bob. And so while they could not capture the city, they did manage to take Fort Pulaski. And so in April of 1862, Union forces took Fort Pulaski. That was important because Fort Pulaski was at the mouth of the Savannah River. So now the city of Savannah, Georgia, is more or less blockaded, but again, not completely. Next slide, please, Bob. Here's a map that sort of points out what really did happen in the end. Both Savannah and Charleston, which the Union Navy will continue, the Navy will continue to blockade, but never very successful. The Savannah and Charleston were taken out of the war, not so much by the Union Navy as by the Union Army. And here you see Sherman's March, and it's Sherman's March that managed this. Savannah was captured by General Sherman in December of 1864. That closes the port. And then shortly after that, Charleston is taken in February of 1865. So it's only in the final analysis that it was the taking of the ports that actually made the blockade and cut the Confederacy off. Next slide, please. And here, of course, is Sherman's very famous dispatch to President Lincoln. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns, plenty of ammunition, and about 25,000 bales of cotton. So Savannah is closed. But Charleston is still open and won't be captured now for another couple months. Next slide, please, Bob. And Charleston was defiant. Charleston really stuck in the craw of the Union, particularly the Union Navy. That's where the war had begun. That's where they had been chased out of the port. And so the Union Navy officers had an obsession with taking Charleston. But you can see here is Fort Sumter, Charleston, South Carolina. So the Union blockading forces could lob in shells on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is a mere shadow of what was before, but she's still in Confederate hands. Next slide, Bob. The task of taking Charleston was given over to Admiral Francis DuPont. Frank, as he was called, and yes, he was a DuPont. We know a good deal, by the way, fellow historians, we know a good deal about DuPont because he wrote to his wife on a regular basis. And so letters to his wife, and to some degree, his wife to him, give us a very good image of what was going on. So in 1863, President Lincoln assigns Admiral DuPont to take Charleston. Next slide, Bob, please. On his flagship, the Wabash, DuPont begins his voyage. And here is the Wabash, and typical, by the way, of the Union Navy vessels. She's a wooden vessel, but you can see she's also steam powered. So she's steam and sail powered. And so the Wabash, next slide, Bob. And here you see the painting of the Wabash. It's called the Wabash leaving for the seat of war. Now, DuPont's attack on Charleston was supposed to be a deep secret. No one was to know. No one was to know. But that was silly because newspaper reporters, Union newspaper reporters, could clearly see the Union Navy organizing in New York Harbor. And so when they announced, they knew where DuPont was going. And so the Confederates had long notice that DuPont was on his way. But here we see a very famous painting of the Wabash leaving New York, ahead of a large squadron now aiming for Charleston, South Carolina. Next slide, Bob. Well, the DuPont and his squadron did indeed attack Charleston. And this is the slide that shows the bombardment of Charleston. In the foreground, there in the lower right side, you can see old Ironsides. Now, Monitor was a particular and rather peculiar design. She wasn't a very good sea boat. As you remember now, Monitor had very low freeboard being the distance between the top of the deck and the waterline. She was good for smooth waters like Hampton Roads. They tried to take her down to Charleston. They towed her, but she hit very heavy weather off Cape Hatteras. She swamped and she sank. So she wasn't at Charleston. She wasn't again, monitors were not well suited for ocean sailing. But here in the foreground, you see a vessel that was suited. She's called Old Ironsides, New Ironsides, I'm sorry. And she was a typical vessel by design. You know, you can see she's got a pointy bow and a rounded stern, but she was simply covered with iron. So she was New Ironsides, not very graceful, certainly not very pretty. And she was there at Charleston bombarding the forts, as were, of course, the other Union vessels. They bombarded the hell out of Charleston and Fort Sumter and the other forts, and it didn't work. It just didn't work. The Confederates held out. Next slide, Bob. One of the Confederate positions defending, can we go back one way? Anyway, one of the Confederate forts defending Charleston was this fort, Battery Wagner. And this is a small peninsula jutting out into Charleston Harbor. There at the top, in the center of this slide, at the top was the actual battery, the fortification. And Battery Wagner was a Confederate fort that helped to defend the harbor. Just to the right of Battery Wagner, you can see the entrance to Charleston Harbor. So she was a prime position to defend the fort. It was the Union Navy's desire to take Battery Wagner because they couldn't really enter the harbor as long as the Confederate guns were there. And so it was the charge of the Union Army to take Battery Wagner. And this, of course, is one of the most famous moments in the Civil War, and certainly a very famous moment in the history of Boston. For the advance force that was charged with taking Battery Wagner was the 54th Massachusetts. John A. Albion was the Republican governor of Massachusetts at the beginning of the Civil War. He was an abolitionist. As the war progressed, Albion and others, not Albion alone, pressed President Lincoln to enlist black soldiers. Now, black soldiers were in the Union Army, but they were in support facilities. They were not fighting men. They were cooks and stewards and that sort of thing. Albion wanted a fighting regiment. And so shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln authorized the raising of black regiments. And of course, among the first, if not the first of the black regiments to be raised, was the one in Massachusetts, the 54th Massachusetts. Next slide, Bob. And it was the charge given to the 54th Massachusetts to assault Battery Wagner. The assault against Battery Wagner by the 54th Massachusetts, and here you see a view of Battery Wagner. You can see it was a very formidable fortification. The assault against Battery Wagner was a disaster. The 54th Massachusetts took very, very heavy losses. Next slide, Bob. The assault, though, went down in history. This man, Sergeant William Kearney, the sergeant in the 54th Massachusetts, was awarded the Medal of Honor, the first African-American to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Oh, I should point out, my friends, that he was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1900, 37 years after the battle. So it took a while for history to catch up with Sergeant Kearney. So he won the Medal of Honor, but perhaps the most famous person to die at the Battery Wagner, next slide, Bob, was the commander of the 54th Regiment, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie Glory, and Shaw's memory lives very much so in Boston. Next slide, Bob. And the memory of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, and of course the 54th Massachusetts, is this memorial, which I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with, sits just opposite the State House. It's August St. Gaudens Memorial to the 54th Massachusetts, which was unveiled in 1897. It is today, as I'm sure you Suffolk students know, surrounded by construction and fence and all that sort of thing, but it is being refurbished, and of course will soon be unveiled again. So the 54 stands as a very important part of Civil War history and certainly the history of Boston. Next slide, Bob. But despite the efforts of the 54th, here you see this is Fort Sumter, a pile of rubble to be sure, but the stars and bars are still flying. And beyond there in the distance, you can see the Union blockading force offshore, but not able to take Charleston. Next slide, Bob. One way in which the Confederates made it difficult for the Union blockading force was through the use of torpedoes. By torpedo in the Civil War, I don't mean the self-propelled torpedoes that we know today that are fired from submarines. The torpedoes in the Civil War period were stationary. They did not have any propulsion system. And this is a typical torpedo of the Civil War vintage. Next slide, Bob, please. And let me show you how it worked. I don't think you'd want to serve in one of these. This is what was called a torpedo boat. Now, the torpedo boat was a vessel that the upper part of the vessel was barely visible. It was like a whale, most of it underwater and just the back visible. You can see the smokestack there in the front. Jutting out from the front of this vessel was a long pole. And at the end of the pole, there was one of these torpedoes. And here was the deal. This torpedo boat was supposed to sneak up on a Union vessel, of course at night, no moon, and that torpedo at the end of that pole had a pike in the end of it. You were supposed to ram that torpedo and the pike into the side of the Union vessel, okay, and then withdraw with a wire that you would unravel, and then at some distance you'd press an electrical charge and it would explode. Nice idea. Didn't work very well. Not well at all. But nonetheless, think about this for a minute. In the US Navy in wartime, if you're on watch and somebody yells torpedo, everything comes to a halt. That is the most frightening thing you can hear at sea, torpedo. And so it was a weapon of terror. Didn't do much damage, but it was a weapon of terror. But the Confederates did have success in one other way. Next slide, please, Bob. They managed to build the first operational submarine. And here it is, the Hundley. She was built in Selma, Alabama, and then brought overland by rail to Charleston. And she was a real submarine. She was propelled by men down below on cranks. Sounds pretty odd and awful, actually. But there were men down, she couldn't have steam, you couldn't have any engine down below because you didn't have any oxygen. And so there were men at a crank. The vessel would go down with ballast, go underwater, and she'd use that system that I just showed you, that long pike with the torpedo at the end. And the men down below would crank and she would move slowly in the water. Well, she did work at Charleston, South Carolina. She went out and she attacked the Union frigate Housatonic. She actually sank the Housatonic. So the Hundley is the first submarine to sink an enemy warship. Unfortunately, the Hundley went down with the Housatonic. So it was a bit of a suicide mission, but very famous. And again, one of those weapons of terror. Submarine, you can imagine that got everybody's attention. Next slide, Bob. Some years ago, Clive Cussler, you may be familiar with, a fiction writer, a dramatic fiction he writes, financed an expedition to find the Hundley, the sunken Hundley, and they found her. Here she is. They raised her. She was in Charleston Harbor. They raised her, and she is still, after many, many years, being preserved. And here you see her being cleaned. She's in a facility just about 10 miles outside of Charleston, South Carolina. A great relic. Just as an aside, too, I might mention that when the Hundley came up, there was still the remnants of the sailors aboard. So the Hundley was also a gravesite. And so there had to be, and was, a ceremony honoring the sailors who had died on the Hundley. Next slide, please, Bob. Well, Charleston is sort of blockaded, Savannah too, but there's another fort along the coast that is also very troublesome, and it is Fort Fisher, Wilmington, North Carolina. And here you see a map of Fort Fisher. It is again a peninsula. Fort Fisher sits at the end of that peninsula, and it's the river that goes to just to the north of that, the Cape Fear River, that goes up to. Because Fort Fisher was so powerful, many, many guns, it was able to keep the blockaders off. So again, it's a matter of, if we're going to blockade Wilmington, we got to take Fort Fisher. And so Fort Fisher then became the object. Next slide, Bob. Early in 1865, January 1865, the Union massed the largest Union naval fleet up to that time. It was a huge, huge fleet. And here you see it offshore, perhaps 100 Union vessels bombarding Fort Fisher. But as I mentioned before, bombarding forts made out of sand and soft logs didn't work very well because most of it just sunk into that. Occasionally, there'd be exploding shells, but they were unreliable. Next slide, please, Bob. Here you see the result of the Union bombardment at Fort Fisher, some shells exploding, but nonetheless, the basic fortifications held. The only way it could be taken was by an army assault, and that was indeed what finally happened. The Union Army was landed, and the Union Army took Fort Fisher. The capture of Fort Fisher just about closed off the Atlantic coast of the Confederacy. The blockade along the Atlantic coast was now complete. But the Union Navy also played a very important role along the interior waterways as well, the Mississippi in particular. The Mississippi, here you see the Mississippi in peacetime. That artery, that north-south artery, it was a critical artery for the movement of supplies and men. It was also, and think about this geographically, it also divided the Confederacy in half. As long as the Confederacy controlled the Mississippi River, you could cross it and the Confederacy would be united. But if the Union could take the Mississippi River, it could divide the Confederacy. The importance of that was that west of the Confederacy was the grain and the provision source for the Confederate Army. It was grain and cattle there in the west that supplied the needs of the Confederate Army. So it was an important, vitally important part of the Confederacy. And here you see a map of the Mississippi River. Down there at the mouth of the Mississippi River, there at New Orleans, going all the way up to the junction of the Ohio River up in Illinois. And again, this long, important waterway. And so, next slide, please, Bob. And so in 1862, the Union Navy began working on the rivers, began the conquest of the Mississippi. They started up here in the north and took Forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee River in February of 1862. And here you see what's going to be typical of the Union assault in the Mississippi and the other rivers of the West. These are gunboats, and they're gunboats with mortars. Mortars are different. Mortars fire shot in a high arc, in a high trajectory. So it would fire them high in the air, and then they would come down vertically on top of the fort. And so mortars became an important part. And here you see, of course, the typical Mississippi River steamboat, which they used with the double stacks, the stern wheelers. So this February 1862 begins the assault on Forts Henry and Donelson. The Union Army commander, Commodore Foote, was in charge of the vessels in the Navy, but the Union Army commander in this operation against Forts Henry and Donelson was a up-and-coming brigadier general named Ulysses Grant, who's going to make his name in the West, and then later Lincoln would call him to the East. The battles on the Mississippi, next slide, please, Bob, required a certain kind of vessel, though. Shallow draft, the rivers are shallow, so you can't have those big, deep draft vessels. The Monitor would never be operating. The Monitor drew about 25 feet. That's simply not going to work on the Mississippi River. So the Union began, and the Confederates too, to some degree, began to design new kinds of vessels. They were armored vessels, but they were lightly armored. You know, the armor on the Monitor was several inches thick, very heavy iron, because these vessels were working in shallow water. They couldn't have heavy armor. That would sink them too deep in the water. So they were called tin-clads. They had some armor, but not a lot. And here you see a typical river steamer. This is a Union vessel, the Choctaw. And what you see there in the stern is the side wheel, that's the paddle wheel, covered with some armament, you see. Then there's armor that comes forward, and the guns are shielded. But the Choctaw is sort of typical of the kinds of vessels that both the Union and the Confederates would use on the rivers. Next slide, please, Bob. Critical to control the river was New Orleans, one of the principal, either the principal Confederate fort. So taking New Orleans became a vital task. And it was assigned to Admiral David Glasgow Farragut. Farragut is, by the way, America's first admiral. Up until the Civil War, we never had a Navy big enough to need an admiral. But now we have a big Navy, we need an admiral. And so Farragut becomes the first U.S. admiral. And Farragut is given the task of taking New Orleans. And so here you see Farragut and his fleet entering the Mississippi in April of 1862. They're going up the Mississippi with vessels, by the way. Most of them are your conventional wooden vessels, steam-powered wooden vessels, and they're forcing their way up the Mississippi, going past the Confederate forts. Farragut made it past the Federal forts, and he made it to New Orleans. The capture of New Orleans is vital because it closes the Mississippi to the Confederacy. It doesn't give the Union control of the Mississippi, because above New Orleans now, Mississippi is still in Confederate hands, but no longer is the port of New Orleans available to the Confederates. Next slide, please, Bob. And so Farragut now begins to go upriver. And here you see in March of 1863, he and his vessels bombard Port Hudson, a fort just north of New Orleans on the Mississippi. The task and the challenge here, and you can see at Port Hudson there is on the left, and the Union Farragut's fleet is there on the right, is that it was one thing to assault these forts, but again, it was like the ports. You could assault the ports, but you couldn't capture them. They had to capture them. And Farragut could not capture Port Hudson. He could bombard it, that's to be sure, but it was impossible to capture it, so it remained in Union hands. Next slide, please, Bob. The most critical Confederate fortification on the Mississippi River was Vicksburg. And Vicksburg was critical because it was one of the few places along the Mississippi, perhaps some of you have had an opportunity to visit the Mississippi or travel to Mississippi. On both sides of the river, it's usually pretty flat. Vicksburg's unusual in that Vicksburg sits on some heights, which gave it an advantage overlooking the river. It was also at Vicksburg that there was a ferry back and forth that moved supplies. So Vicksburg was an important supply point, a connection point between the east and west side of the Mississippi, and an important Confederate bastion. Farragut continues up the Mississippi, again, if you could have the slide, Bob, past Port Hudson, and he bombarded, here you see Farragut's fleet bombarding Vicksburg. Vicksburg, you can see the heights there in the background. But here's Farragut's problem. First, he doesn't have the infantry forces to take Vicksburg. Secondly, the Mississippi, the level of water in Mississippi rises and falls pretty dramatically. And in the summertime, the level of the river fell. Farragut's deep draft vessels, the kind that you see here, couldn't stay upriver. They'd run aground. So Farragut could bombard Mississippi for a short period of time, but then he had to withdraw. So Farragut then, in 1862, is not able to take Vicksburg. He goes back down the river. However, while Farragut is retreating, other things are taking place in the Western theater of the Civil War. Principally, of course, the rise of Ulysses S. Grant. Next slide, please, Bob. It is Grant who is given the task of taking Vicksburg. Grant's taking of Vicksburg is one of the most amazing tactical evolutions you can imagine. What he did is first, the Union Navy comes up the Mississippi River, okay, and takes control of the river. Not taking Vicksburg, mind you, but takes control of the river. Once they have control of the river, then Grant can move his army across the river north of Vicksburg. He cannot advance on Vicksburg from the north on the east side of the Mississippi. The reason being that north of Vicksburg, on the east side of the Mississippi, is a lot of swampland, a lot of bayous, not a good place for an army. And so he crosses the Mississippi to the west side and then marches his army south until he gets south of Vicksburg. And then he crosses again with the protection of the Union Navy, crosses to the east side of the Mississippi and is able to advance on Vicksburg from the south. Next slide, please, Bob. And here you, no, back one. And here you see, okay, Grant assaults Vicksburg, July 1863, and takes Vicksburg. Grant then, of course, telegraphs Lincoln, some great quote, the father of waters now flows unvexed to the Mississippi, which means, of course, that the Union Army, the Union, now has complete control of the Mississippi. And by the way, July 1863, critical date. But while Grant takes Vicksburg in the east, July 4th, 1863, is the Battle of Gettysburg. So the capture of Vicksburg, the capture of Gettysburg in the east mark a huge turning point in the American Civil War. So now the Confederacy is cut off from its supply of food. The Mississippi is in Union hands. The Confederacy is now divided. But there still remains for the Union Navy another task. Bob, next slide, please. And that is the Gulf Coast. We still have a port, an important port, that is still being used by the Confederate blockade runners. It is Mobile. And here you see on this chart, Mobile Bay, right there in the center. And there, sort of to the top, that dark area, that's the city of Mobile. The entrance to Mobile Bay, down at the very south, is protected by very strong Confederate forts. It is now Farragut's task, though, to take Mobile, or at least to close Mobile. Taking the city of Mobile is another job, but he needs the task of closing the port of Mobile. And so, next slide, please, Bob. And so Farragut then arrives with his force, and Farragut's force now is a combination. We're now, of course, in 1864, so we have ironclads and regular wooden armed frigates. Farragut's flagship is the USS Hartford. Farragut wants to lead the attack into Mobile Bay on board the Hartford. His commanders suggest, sir, with all due respect, that puts you in a very vulnerable position. We recommend that the Hartford take the second position, and that the frigate Brooklyn take the van being the point position. Farragut agrees. Now, the entrance to Mobile Bay is mined with torpedoes, as I mentioned before. They don't move, they're just like mines. We would call them mines. It's a narrow entrance. And so the Union fleet begins its movement. The Brooklyn is ahead of the Farragut, is ahead of the Hartford. As the Brooklyn begins to enter Mobile Bay, her commander signals back to Farragut, mines ahead, torpedoes ahead, torpedoes ahead. And the Brooklyn begins to change course. This is very, very dangerous because the entrance to Mobile Bay is very narrow. Should the Brooklyn change course, she's likely to run aground, and that would be a disaster. In the meantime, Admiral Farragut on board the Hartford is up in the rigging. He has actually climbed up in the mast. He had to do that because this is an era of black gunpowder. And when these ships are firing their cannon, they literally create a huge fog of gunpowder, of smoke. You really can't see anything. So you have to go up in the rigging to see over the smoke. Farragut is up in the rigging, looking over the smoke. He sees the signal from the semaphore, the flag from Brooklyn, torpedoes ahead. He sees Brooklyn beginning to alter her course. He immediately signals Brooklyn, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Brooklyn comes back onto her course, charges into Mobile, and by the way, hits some of those torpedoes, but they don't explode. They were duds. And so now the Union fleet is into Mobile Bay. And here in this slide, you see the Battle of Mobile Bay. You see the USS Hartford there on the left, and the Union monitors, or the Union monitors to the right, and right in the center, that ironclad that you see, that's the USS Tennessee. She's under the command of a very famous Confederate captain, Franklin Buchanan. Before the war, Franklin Buchanan had been the superintendent of the United States Naval Academy. When the war came, he left U.S. service and served the Confederates. And so that's Frank Buchanan. There he is in USS Tennessee. Frank Buchanan comes charging down. It's the suicide mission. And of course, the Tennessee is sunk, is damaged and sunk by the Union forces. And so the Union fleet then takes Mobile Bay. That closes off that Confederate force. And so by the combination of blockade, offshore blockading, but really the taking of the ports secures the Union blockade of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. But again, as I mentioned, it's never, until they take the ports, it's never 100%. So the Confederates are always able, through most of the war, to have some communication, to get arms, ammunition, and to have some personal diplomatic connection, not recognition, but connection. However, someone asked before, early on, about them building a navy. As I mentioned, they really didn't build a navy. They didn't have that technology. They didn't have the industrial base. But they were able to get to sea, out to blue water, Confederate raiders. Next slide, please, Bob. These Confederate raiders were vessels that were built abroad. The Confederates, since the other nations did not recognize the hostilities, the Confederates could indeed, through diplomatic negotiations and through just paying, build vessels abroad. And so they were able to send, not many, but enough that were very troublesome, to send Confederate raiders to sea. Here we see an early Confederate raider there on the left. She's the CSS Nashville. And the Nashville is burning the Harvey Birch. This is 1861. The Harvey Birch was an American clipper ship. And there you can see that she's going up in smoke. Next slide, please, Bob. The most famous of these Confederate raiders was Raphael Sims. Again, before the war, Raphael Sims was an officer in the United States Navy. And when the war comes, Raphael Sims joins the Confederates. Next slide, please, Bob. And early in the war, Raphael Sims is in command of the Confederate steamer Sumter. Now, which is a Confederate raider. Here is the problem that the Confederates have with their raiders. They're not able to get many of them to sea, maybe a dozen or so there aren't many. But they do serve a purpose. And the purpose they serve is terror. They terrorize the Union merchant fleet. And they do take a number of Union merchant vessels. One of the things that they're able to do is that they drive up marine insurance rates. If you're an owner of an American vessel, you're now going to have to pay a higher insurance rate because of the fear of a Confederate raider. As a result of that, many Union ship owners take their vessels and they put them under another flag. That is to say that a vessel that once flew the American flag now flies the flag of Portugal, or flies the flag of Sweden, or flies some other flag, and therefore it's become a neutral vessel, not subject to capture by the Confederates. This has a very long-term effect on the American merchant marine. During the course of the American Civil War, about half of the tonnage of the American merchant marine disappears. Now, some of that, of course, is sunk by Confederate raiders, true enough. But a lot of that tonnage goes to foreign flag. And so the American merchant marine suffers greatly from the Civil War, not only from damage done by the raiders, but also because American ship owners reflagged their vessels. We call them today flags of convenience. They just found a convenient flag. Today, the flags of convenience are, the Seychelles Islands or Panama or whatever it happens to be. But so American merchant marine does suffer a demise, but most of it because they went to another flag. Well, here you see Raphael Sims when he's in command of the USS Sumter. And you see him here right there in the center. Very, very romantic figure and a very able captain. His most famous voyages, though, and the most famous voyage of any of the Confederate raiders, is the Confederate steamer Alabama. The Alabama is built in Birkenhead. Birkenhead is the port that is just opposite Liverpool in England. Liverpool is on the River Mersey. And on the north side of the Mersey is Liverpool. South side of the Mersey is Birkenhead. And a Confederate agent, his name is Bullock. Now, Mr. Bullock is a Confederate agent living in Liverpool. Mr. Bullock, by the way, is the uncle of President Theodore Roosevelt. Interesting connection. Bullock has money. He has money because the Confederates have been able to sell cotton. He manages to contract with a Liverpool, Birkenhead shipping firm called Laird and Sons, L-A-I-R-D, to build a merchant vessel. A merchant vessel, of course. In the meantime, everybody knows what Bullock is about. The United States minister, that is, ambassador to England, is a man named Charles Francis Adams. Charles Francis Adams keeps a keen, this is a spy story that goes back and forth. Everybody's spying on everybody else. But everybody knows that this vessel being built in the yard of Mr. Laird is really going to be a Confederate raider, but they don't really have the evidence to seize the vessel, etc., etc. Well, it comes time for the her name, they don't give her a name. She's just a hull number. There's no name at this point. It's time for her to take her test run, her trial run. And so a crew arrives, interestingly enough, a lot of Southerners, mostly Englishmen though. And they board the Alabama. They take on board some other guests. This is going to be a picnic run. So they sail out the Mercy. This is just a trial run. We'll be right back. They get offshore into international waters. Suddenly, Captain Raphael Sims emerges, puts up the Confederate flag, invites all of the guests to get off the vessel, which they do. He then heads for the Azore Islands, and there in the Azores, he takes on guns that have been secretly shipped to the Azore Islands. Okay? And now the Alabama is on her way to raid. A remarkable story. She's going to be in nearly every ocean, sinks, captures, burns about 60 Union vessels. She's in the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. She seems to be everywhere. And by the way, she is sighted everywhere. Everybody sees the ghost of the Alabama somewhere. Okay. Next slide, please. She becomes the bête noire of the Union Navy. Now, of course, the Union Navy has a problem. Oh, they could send ships to look for the Alabama, but they send ships to look for the Alabama. Who's going to blockade the coast? So this is a conundrum for Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles. Nonetheless, some ships are sent to scout for the Alabama. Among them is the USS Kissage. The Kissage is in the North Atlantic. She's over there in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, actually. And she's under the command of John A. Andrew. Captain Andrew is a Bostonian, by the way. His home was over just not far from the Northeastern University campus, so if you'll pardon a little plug there. And so Kissage, under the command of Andrew, is looking for the Alabama. The Alabama has the problem that all raiders have. That is to say, once you leave port, where are you going to go? If you can't, you're a war vessel, so you can't really go into a neutral port because they're not going to welcome you. But over time, you need supplies, and also a wooden vessel like this, the bottom grows foul, you need coal. This is a real problem for a surface raider. And so the Alabama now is up in the Atlantic off the coast of France, and she takes refuge in the port of Cherbourg. She has no choice. Her engines are cranky, her hull is just filled with growth. She has no choice. And she goes into Cherbourg. But going into Cherbourg, she's told by the French authorities, you have 24 hours. 24 hours and you have to leave, international law. And so the Alabama stays for 24 hours, doesn't get much done, of course, in that time. And she's now forced to leave. As she exits Cherbourg, by the way, it's said that a French Navy band plays Dixie. And the French were sympathetic to the Confederacy. The arrival of the Alabama in France had been telegraphed. It had been quickly known. And the Kissage learns of the Alabama being in Cherbourg. She immediately steams for Cherbourg and arrives at Cherbourg in time to see the Alabama coming out. And here you see the next slide, please, Bob. The Alabama meets the Kissage. It's really not a fair battle. Again, the Alabama's bottom is foul. She's slow, et cetera, et cetera. And the Kissage manages to sink the Alabama. She sinks there. But before she sinks, by the way, most of the crew, including her captain, Raphael Sims, managed to escape. They escaped to England. Sims is never captured. After the war, Sims returns to Alabama and becomes something of a local hero. So he lives out his life. The sinking of the Alabama in June of 1864 pretty much marks the end of the career of these Confederate raiders. One little footnote, the remains of the Alabama were discovered about 20 or 25 years ago. And she is a burial site. Sunken war vessels are deemed to be grave sites, and so there's some respect given to her. You can't dive on her or anything like that. And there is actually a joint U.S.-French commission, which meets, I guess, maybe annually or maybe less often to survey that. I have a friend who for some years served in that commission. And again, it was a good gig. It meant you got to go to Paris about once a year on U.S. government's tab to talk about the burial remains of the U.S. of the Alabama, which was considered to be a war prize. But she's still there in the bottom of the just off the coast of France. Next slide, please, Bob. This is a rather famous painting done at the end of the war, very end of the war, when Lincoln went down to meet on the James River, went down to meet with his war commanders. And here you see them. They're on the far right, Admiral Porter. There to the right, that's to the left of Lincoln. Just to the right of Lincoln is General Grant, and to the right of General Grant is General Sherman. The prime officers, the prime commanders, Admiral Porter among them, sitting here now, again, at the very end of the war, discussing what is to be done. So this marked the end of the war, April 1865. And this is a very famous painting done by an artist named G.P.A. Healy. Mr. Healy is an artist. I suspect that most of you have seen another one of his very famous works. G.P.A. Healy is the man who painted that painting, that very, very large painting in Faneuil Hall, titled Webster's Second Reply to Hayne. It's where Daniel Webster stands in the well of the Senate, giving a speech replying to Senator Hayne from South Carolina, in which Webster utters those famous words, "I go serve for the Union now and forever." So Mr. Healy painted this as well, the Peacemakers, marking the end of the war. And so the U.S. Navy then plays a very critical role in the Civil War. It manages to isolate the Confederacy, manages to reduce its effect on the high seas, although not much success there. But in the end, General Scott was right. It took the anaconda to squeeze the Confederacy, and it took far longer than anyone thought at the beginning of the war. So here endeth the lesson, as they say once in a while, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments you might have.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Fowler.
You're welcome, Professor Allison. It's fun to be back in sort of a classroom, not quite, but it's fun to be with students in any case.
So I know Ray has a lot of questions about steam vessels, but other people may also have questions about the war and other things. So Ray, why don't you start us off?
So about ironclads.
Yes.
So, they couldn't carry a lot of coal.
No.
So how did the U.S. Navy, did they have were they pretty much tethered to their home ports and such? Did they have supply ships? How the heck did that work?
Very good question. Excellent question. The way it worked is once they took Port Royal, and by the way, I didn't mention this, but they retook Norfolk as well after the Monitor Merrimack. What they did is that colliers, coal vessels, would deliver coal, and they'd have big supplies, depots of coal at places like Port Royal and Norfolk. And the steam vessels would go to those ports to resupply. They were very inefficient engines, very, very inefficient engines. Let me give you just an example of how much coal they would use. In the 1850s.
Were they expansion type engines, or had those not been developed yet?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question.
No, of course they weren't turbines, but
no, not turbines, not turbines. No, these are not triple expansion engines. No, these are really, they devour coal. I was going to mention that a major steamer crossing the Atlantic, say in 1860, would consume somewhere between 800 and 1,000 tons of coal per day.
My gracious!
Oh yeah, they were huge. So yes, you had to. They couldn't. That's why steam vessels were at the beginning of the war were not very good blockaders, because they
were not.
They were not. But on the other hand, you had to have your steam up all the time, because you never knew when a blockade runner was going to show up. So you couldn't have the boilers down. You couldn't have the furnaces down. You had to keep the furnaces running. So yeah. So it was a big logistical problem. And I know the triple expansion engine becomes popular really after it's around. It's been invented, but these are not triple expansion engines. No, and they're not turbines. Certainly not.
Goodness no, the turbines weren't invented till the Parson engine, I think.
That's right. Yeah, they're around in the 1880s, and Parsons makes them popular in the 1890s, right?
Yeah, and then you got they didn't really become a thing till Lusitania and Mauretania.
Correct. That's correct. Yes. And I just might add, of course, then in the period of World War I and after World War I, you get the conversion to oil. And
Oh, yeah.
change-
That
Okay.
changes everything.
Yeah, we're talking about coal, and they just devour coal.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Another question, please. Great question.
Actually, does anyone else have a question? Because I wanted to, anyone? One thing we've been talking about over the course of the semester, Bill, and this is more general than what you just outlined. We've been talking a lot about naval leadership, and students are talking about who their favorite captains are, least favorite. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what makes a good or a bad, and give examples of naval captains at any period that you would see.
I think that one of the some essential elements here, courage. I think, quite frankly, Farragut going up in the rigging of the Hartford was extraordinary. So I think courage, example. I think that courage is example. Integrity, okay? Integrity. I respect for your enemy. Don't ever think it's going to be easy. Also, skill. In the period we're talking about here, ship handling, knowing how to manage a vessel, which was really in some ways more important in the age of sail, when it's a little bit more fickle than steam. But those are the essential. But I really think example, integrity, courage were absolute, and by the way, okay, nothing's changed, are absolutely essential to a good naval leader. Yes. Also, and in case in the Civil War, and this comes later, is the capacity to adapt. Naval officers in the Civil War had little, one could say no experience in cooperating with the Army, okay, in terms of amphibious operations. And so that becomes an essential element as well, particularly on the rivers where the Army and Navy had to cooperate. So a capacity to understand and to be able to use coordinate with the Army. And later, of course, in all of our wars, certainly in the Pacific War in World War II, that cooperation between land and naval forces. So all of those elements, I think. But I really would have to say, it seems to me the essential element was example. Example.
Great. Sean, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So we're talking about like the Civil War, and that's in like the mid 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And so, was there were ironclads like a thing in like the Mexican-American War, like another like similar time period sort of war, or is that strictly a Civil War like phenomenon?
They had, now you can trace back, and I suppose you could go back to some degree to ancient times when they didn't cover with iron, but covered with heavy sheetings of wood. So that the notion of an ironclad, let me just get a little bit of my coffee here, was not new. Okay? But they had not been used in combat until the Civil War. As I mentioned, both the French and the British had ironclads, but there were real difficulties. The weight, for example, these ironclads, once you put iron on the Monitor, as small as she was, relatively small, she took almost 30 feet of water, which really limited her operation. So it's in the Civil War that they first engaged, the two ironclads engaged in combat with each other. And they proved their worth. Neither the Monitor nor the Merrimack had their ironclad penetrated in that battle.
Okay, so I have a little follow-up one then. If you had to serve on an ironclad or a traditional frigate, which one would you pick?
Frigate. The ironclads, I can't begin to tell you the distress, the awful environment. Just think about this. You got 100+ guys down below in this tin box, in this iron box. Just think about the smells. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't sound pleasant.
Just think about the temperatures. Just think about the lack of air. And by the way, in battle, the noise. In the case of the Monitor, some of the injuries during the battle came, imagine this, that large, 50, 60-pound iron balls hitting the casement of the Monitor, dislodging inside rivets. And so now you have pieces of metal flying around inside the vessel. Oh no, I would rather have been with Farragut on the Hartford than inside the Monitor. Oh no, I think it was terrible, terrible service.
Sarah.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more acquisition for the Confederacy.
Sorry,
I know you talked a bit about the way that they acquired ships, the bigger ships, but I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the other resources.
Oh, sure. They had a lot of small vessels that they used along the coast that would, and they built, by the way, a number of ironclads as best they could. And so for example, in the area around North Carolina, in the Hatteras, I mentioned the Union took the Hatteras forts. That's true. But nonetheless, the Confederates did have some ironclads that they operated within the Sound. So they could torment the Union like that. They also had small vessels, of course, which they might come out and attack and just sort of pester. But they never had any real warships that could stand up against the very large Union frigates. They used the Hunley. They used torpedoes, which I mentioned they used, that sort of thing. But in terms of a one-on-one combat, no, they really couldn't do that very well. They simply didn't have the capacity to build. They didn't have the industrial capacity to build vessels, large vessels.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see, Ray, do you have another question?
Not at the moment. I'm thinking.
Okay. How about you, Sean?
Yeah, I actually, my mind was tracing back towards we talked about like the bombardment of Charlestown and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so how did the city eventually like break? I don't know if we touched on it.
Yeah, no, you're right, I didn't. In point of fact, the city of Charleston was out of range of the Union guns. As an example, Battery Wagner. If the Union had been able to take Battery Wagner, they might have been within range of the city. The Union did have a very large gun that they mounted called the Swamp Angel. It was a huge gun. And they used that to bombard Charleston. But of course, the Swamp Angel could only fire one round every half hour or whatever it was. But the problem with the Swamp Angel was, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to Charleston or that area, but it is swampy. And so every time the Swamp Angel fired her gun, she sank into the mud. So that wasn't very good. So Charleston is eventually, after Sherman takes Savannah, a portion of his army, not Sherman, marches up towards Charleston. And it's at that point that the Confederates abandon Charleston. They evacuate Charleston. So it is, in fact, the approach of the Union Army that forces the Confederates to evacuate Charleston. It's not the Union Navy.
Okay. And I thought of another one while we were talking about that too. We talked about like the 54th Massachusetts in terms of Army service, but were there African Americans in the Navy as well?
Oh, yes. In fact, again, you're dealing with statistics and, mid-19th century, they're not entirely reliable, but it's estimated that roughly 25% of the sailors in the Union Navy were African Americans, which sort of really makes sense. Because if you look at the history of the American merchant marine in the 19th century, you do find among American merchant ships a significant portion of the crew being African Americans. One of the reasons being is nobody wanted to go to sea. That being a sailor on a merchant ship was hardly an ideal occupation. So it went to those who were least able or who couldn't be employed elsewhere. And so the significant number of African Americans in the merchant marine and about 25% of the sailors in the Union Navy were African American. The next time you're looking at photographs of the Navy photographs from the Civil War crew photographs, the sort of ones I just showed you, but the crew, not officers, the crew. Take a careful look with a magnifying glass, and I can almost guarantee you that in every photograph of the crew of a Union naval vessel, you're going to find African Americans.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Thank you.
I have a question. I mean, seeing that last photograph called the Peacemaker and just talking about naval innovations, of course, made me think about the Peacemaker on the USS Princeton. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that episode.
Yes. The USS Princeton, 1840s, was a U.S. Navy vessel. Erickson was involved with the design of the vessel, by the way. She was screw propelled. That is, as I said, most of the vessels had side wheels. And the Princeton was different. She had a screw propeller. And she also had a very large cannon, a gun, called the Peacemaker. So in one of those moments, and you look back on this and you wonder, what were they thinking? The Princeton came up the Anacostia River, and they wanted to demonstrate Princeton as a new kind of technology. And so a number of very important American officials, congressional officers, cabinet officers, came to visit the Princeton to watch the demonstration, and they did. And they demonstrated the firing of the Peacemaker. The Peacemaker blew up. Killed, as I recall, killed the Secretary of the Navy and killed several other people.
Yeah.
It didn't do much for Erickson's reputation, except that he didn't design the gun. The gun wasn't his, but the vessel was his. So Erickson sort of, in a way, lived under a little bit of a cloud after that. But the Peacemaker was just a colossal disaster. This gun exploded and killed, again, a number of people.
Wow.
So the next time someone wants to show you how a large artillery piece works, give it a lot of distance.
Yeah. Let's see. Can I, Ray, do you have another question?
Yes, I do have one about
Sure.
screw propulsion. When did that really become, widespread and standard?
You mean screw propellers?
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, the Princeton was, so that's in the mid-late 1840s. The first war vessel to have screw propulsion was a vessel in the Royal Navy called a Rattler, which was about 1838, 1839. But here is a problem with screw propulsion. They really had the screw, of course, is in a long, obviously at the exit of the stern of the vessel, but you have to have a connection, a propeller, the drive shaft, a shaft that runs from the engine to the propeller. And they had problems with securing that watertight. You have a hole through the hull running out to this propeller. And that was one of the continuing problems, was securing that. They leaked like hell, was the problem. And so they had to perfect that. The other issue was it was expensive. It was more expensive. So the side wheelers were less expensive and quite frankly, more reliable, because you didn't have to worry about this shaft going through your hull. So that's why it took a while to perfect the technology. The other thing, and this is kind of just anecdotal, but it's true, seafarers tend to be pretty conservative. And a lot of naval officers, really, frankly, they preferred to see the propulsion mechanism rather than, which was a side wheel or some kind of paddle wheel, which they could get to and operate, et cetera, et cetera. They saw the propeller down below, this shaft, et cetera. They just didn't really like it. And so they were very reluctant to ship, but it was far more efficient in propelling the vessel. And also, quite frankly, side wheel vessels were extremely vulnerable in combat. One cannonball through your side wheel, you're dead.
Storm, and you're screwed. And if you don't have auxiliary sails, you are stranded.
That's right. So the propeller, in many, many ways, had an advantage. But like all technology, we think of technology as being instantly available in a dock.
Oh, it's not.
No. It took a while. But yes, the propeller. But the first one around 1838, 39. But it takes a while for it to really move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, your hand is still up. Do you have another question?
Yep.
No, I'm sorry. I'll turn that off now.
Okay. I have a question, Bill. I mean, you've written biographies of Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Silas Talbot. I wonder if you could tell us what drew you to chronicling his life as opposed to, say, Preble or Farragut or another captain.
You mean Silas Talbot?
Silas Talbot, yes.
All right. Well, there is a story there. For many years, I taught at Mystic Seaport during the summertime in a graduate seminar. I loved it. I'd go down there and they'd give me lovely quarters. I was within 200 yards of the classroom. And I taught.
You're really doing a great job selling being a maritime historian.
It was fantastic. It was lovely. Well, in any case, and I worked with a wonderful librarian. The library at Mystic Seaport, by the way, if you're dealing in maritime history, it's a place to go. In any case, one day the librarian, name was Jerry Morris, good friend of mine. We used to go drinking together. Jerry came up to me and he said, Bill, I said, we had this large collection of papers that was given to us by a family named Vitor, Vietor. A name perhaps not familiar to most of you, I understand that. But on the other end, the Vitor family was, shall we say, a very generous contributor to Mystic Seaport. It was a New York family. They had been involved, by the way, with the packet ships in the 1830s and 40s. And Jerry said to me, we got this large collection, the papers of Silas Talbot. He said, it's a wonderful collection. We need someone to write a biography. Would you be interested? Well, my goodness. There it was. I had a huge collection of papers right there at my, right in front of me, all together in pretty good order. And the Vitors had given enough money to organize the papers. So I said, Jerry sounds like an interesting task. So I wrote a biography of Silas Talbot and thoroughly enjoyed it. I really did enjoy it a great deal. But that, you know, as an historian, as a writer, those are the kinds of, it's serendipity sometimes.
Yeah.
I hadn't planned to write a biography of Silas Talbot. It turned out he fitted in, and I made my way through the papers. He fitted in with a number of other interests. It was great fun, and I guess I did a good service for Mystic Seaport. That was important.
It's kind of the opposite of the Samuel Adams, because he burned most of his papers. So.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, Samuel Adams was a different matter entirely. My God, he was a kind of a conundrum. Really, writing about Samuel Adams, you needed the views of other people and official records. But Adams himself, and the same thing with John Hancock, I might add. He didn't have many personal papers either. So yeah, that was a different. Those gentlemen were a different challenge.
No.
By the way, I just one thing about Silas Talbot, for you historians, you should know this, that at the end of his life, Silas Talbot left to his heirs what he called a large trunk full of my papers. And that was exactly what I had, a large trunk full of his papers.
Wow. That's great. Yeah.
So look for somebody who's meticulous like that if you want to write a biography.
Now you've been more recently working on the steam power. You have a great book on the Cunard line, Collins line. Can you tell us how you got into that project?
Oh, sure. That was pretty easy. I as I said, I guess at the beginning of this, for the last thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate that. For the last 30 or 35 years, I've been working on cruise ships. Again, great gig. And I've done about 2 dozen, maybe a little bit more, trips on the Queen Mary 2. And so that really sparked my interest. Here was the great famous Cunard line, it's famous today. And so I became very, very interested in that. And it turns out that Cunard's principal competitor, at least for a short period of time, was a man named Collins. And so here I am then. I was able to write a kind of a dual biography, really, of Cunard and Collins and this rivalry between the two. So yeah, I must say, Bob, and maybe this is true with you, but for me, everything that I've written starts with a sort of personal interest, that there is something that just sort of clicks, or I raise my eyebrow, or I think, gee, that's interesting. So I have to have, there's got to be something, I got to have a hook. I have to have a hook.
Yeah. And of late, you've been writing a lot about George Washington. We were talking earlier about leadership and.
A thing about it, my fellow historians, let me share this with you, that this book in many ways is different because you know what? It's digitally based.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, virtually, all of the extant writings of George Washington have been digitized and are available through the University of Virginia Press. Not only that, but Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, you can go right down the list.
Mm-hmm.
Virtually all these papers have been digitized. And so this has been an incredible venture for me, sitting here in front of my screen, looking at this. So it's been, so if you're thinking about writing history, look at the digital world, an enormous, incredible amount of information out there.
It's true. Sean, your hand is up again.
Yeah. Okay. So, you've done American maritime history. You've done George Washington and stuff like that, and the early founding fathers. What other topics have you covered? Like any cool ones?
They're all cool.
They're all cool, but I want to see what he thinks is like the coolest. You know?
Yeah. What, have I done anything cool? Great question. No, those are my principles. Well, there's one other thing that I'm interested in, and I've written about, but not a lot. I would, on this topic, I defer to Professor Allison, and that's the history of Boston, which I'm very interested in as well. But Mr. Allison is far more expert in that than I am. But Boston fascinates me too, as a Bostonian. By the way, I might just say that really is how I began my career. I went to a graduate school at the University of Notre Dame. And Notre Dame, as you might know, is in the Midwest, a long way from the ocean. And I love my years at Notre Dame, but I really am a New Englander and a Bostonian. So when it came time to do my dissertation, I was looking for a title that was somewhere in the East. And I found a topic, a biography about a man who helped run the Navy during the American Revolution. And that sort of tied me to the sea. Then when I came back, lucky, I'm very fortunate to get a job teaching at Northeastern. And when I came back to Boston, you know, you really can't be a historian and American historian in Boston, particularly early America. You got to be interested in maritime history. I mean, that's at the heart of the community. So it was being in Boston, being interested in maritime history, American Revolution, all sort of fell into place for me. I'm a very lucky fellow, very lucky fellow.
Let's see, Ray, your hand is up again.
It is?
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry. Wait, was my hand up?
It was. Did you have a question?
I'm sorry. I didn't know.
Okay.
That's okay,
I wondered
Ray.
why you kept calling on me. I'm sorry. I'm bad with technology.
No, you don't have to apologize. You don't have to apologize. I love questions. Although I must tell you an anecdote that Mr. Allison once shared with me.
Yes.
About a South Boston barkeep. This is when Mr. Bulger, Billy Bulger, was active in politics, and this barkeep was, I think, the treasurer. He was an officer.
This campaign treasurer, yes.
Treasurer. And a reporter came to ask the campaign treasurer about some aspect of Mr. Bulger's campaign, I guess. And the reporter said, I have a few questions for you, Mr. So-and-so. And the barkeep responded to him, there's one thing I don't answer, it's questions. So that's just a little South Boston story for you.
It's a kind of advice that sticks with you.
Okay. Yeah. Are there other questions? You have me here for a bit?
Yeah, Trevor. Trevor usually has a lot of things to say. So I'm sorry to catch you by surprise.
No, sorry, I didn't have any questions today.
Okay.
I assume that when there are no questions, I've been so clear and explicit this.
That's it. You've answered everything. You've inspired everyone. If you were to suggest a research topic for some aspiring historian, what are some of the things you wish that someone else would write about?
You know, one of the things that interests me is the rivalry in the period of the early 20th century, roughly 1900 thereabouts, up until 1939, World War II, the intense rivalry on the North Atlantic for passenger ships. You have the French and the Germans and the British in competition, and not the Americans. The Americans aren't really a part of it. We're outside of it. But you have these three nations. World War II is the interruption. I got that. But there's this intense rivalry amongst these three nations for domination for the transatlantic passenger trade. This is, of course, before the age of the airplane, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to get there, you got to go by sea. I think that would be an interesting topic to examine this rivalry amongst these three powers.
Oh, wow.
That'd be a good topic.
I think you've given Ray an idea.
Yeah.
I have read quite a lot, and they would just build bigger, faster.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Ships.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
Goodness gracious.
Well, and obviously in this is the Titanic. She's an example, but
the whole Olympic class.
Yes, I don't want to say I'm tired of the Titanic. I won't say that.
Aren't we all?
But when I go on board ships and lecture, there are two things I try not to lecture about. I don't like to lecture about shipwrecks. I don't think that's a good topic when you're out in the middle of the
Atlantic. That's always a good topic.
Not if you're on a ship.
Not if you're on a ship. I don't think that's a good one. And I try to stay away from the Titanic. That's kind of. But in any case, I have to tell you, if you're on board the ship, they always ask about the Titanic. People always ask about the Titanic.
And if they see a four-funneled liner, they're like, Titanic. And I'm like, you get sick of explaining it to people. And I'm like, oh my God, that's Mauritania. That's Kaiser Wilhelm the Gotha. That's whatever. And you're like, oh my God, does anybody know about any liner besides the bloody Titanic?
Now, Ray, I have a suggestion for you, since you're really interested. A person you might want to look at and examine is a man named Albert Balin, B-A-L-L-I-N. Albert Balin, B-A-L-L-I-N. He is a German, a friend of the Kaisers, and the driving force behind the German liners of the early 20th century. Albert Balin, interesting character, about whom not much has been written, frankly.
There's a lot, aside from your books on maritime history, I'm really thinking about fiction. Are there any books you might recommend of maritime fiction, or books or films?
Yes, I love Patrick O'Brien.
Okay.
And I love the Hornblower series. Okay, they're fiction, and it's light reading. Okay, it's light reading. But Patrick O'Brien and the Hornblower series are some of my favorites. Yes. Also, by the way, there are other. Rudyard Kipling wrote a little bit about. John McPhee wrote, but Patrick O'Brien and the Hornblower series, I recommend it. They're great casual reading. Just good yarns, as they would say.
I know you're not one to moon over Melville, but
well, I have to tell you, now you haven't assigned Melville, have you, Professor Ellison?
no, I have not. No. It was all I could do when you were talking about the Merrimack and the Monitor, not to start going about warriors and now mere operatives. And
I have to tell you, everyone, when I used to assign, every once in a while, I don't know, I lost my head, I guess. I would assign Moby Dick.
Yeah.
And I after a while, I realized this was hopeless. Nobody's going to read it. And it was clear from the exams, you know about this, my friends, don't you, that they didn't really get into Moby Dick. So I decided, no, I stopped assigning Moby Dick. It just wasn't worth it. I did assign some of his Melville, some of his shorter books, but you got to be realistic. And Moby Dick is long and kind of dreary.
I did have, there was a semester I did assign it. And I had one student, and he was so proud of himself for finishing it. He brought it to every class. And then I had another student, she saw the reading list. She got Moby Dick. She dropped the class, but she told me later she finished the book. So it's an achievement. So now that you've mentioned it, we have 3 weeks. Maybe we could do this in the last few weeks of the semester.
Well, one of the characteristics of a good teacher is being realistic.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
So what's all the hate around Moby Dick about then?
It's not hate. It's just that
we love Moby Dick.
We love Moby Dick, except that it just gets so tiresome after a while. I mean, how many times can you read about Ishmael in the cold November of my soul? And he goes, okay, fine. But the other, I don't. By the way, don't tell my colleagues that. Oh my God, I'll be running out of the business. He said bad things about Moby Dick.
No, I love Moby Dick, and
I love Moby Dick.
White Jacket and Typee and Umo. I mean, he wrote these books that really sold very well about maritime life, and then he decided to write this great book, and never really sold. And he essentially quit writing. He did write a few things. He wrote poetry. His Civil War poetry is well worth reading because he's writing this during the actual time about events, Shiloh and the battle between the Merrimack and the Monitor and the assassination of Lincoln. It's really powerful stuff. Then I guess he married well and didn't.
Yes, he did. He did. If you want to read a short Melville, it's pretty good. It's Billy Budd.
Oh yeah.
Last book, and actually there is actually an opera.
Yes.
Of Billy Budd, but that's good show. But but for the record, I recommend you read Moby Dick.
Yes.
I was gonna say I've never read it, and I hear all the good things. I was like, maybe I.
Well, I know that the New Bedford Whaling Museum does an annual marathon reading of it. I know they did it in Provincetown a couple of years ago. I don't know if they still do that, which is maybe we could organize something like that.
They used to at Mystic Seaport. The Charles W. Morgan is the last surviving wooden whale ship, and they used to read all of Moby Dick down in the hold of the Charles W. Morgan, and they would each get about 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and so it would go on for ever and ever. Reading Moby Dick down in the hold of the Charles W. Morgan.
Wow. That's the chapters are short, which is good.
Oh yeah. Well, so much for Melville.
Yes. Well. Okay, other questions? Okay, Ray recommends A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. That is a really good book. Yeah.
That's true, yes. Yeah.
Good. Well, this, I mean, this is great. I know people will have more questions, but I think we should probably let you go since I know you have work to get back to. And
well, I have my dog. What I have to get back to right now is to walk my dog.
Yeah. Okay.
Who's right now chewing at my ankles.
Okay, well, then we really should let you go. So,
thanks all.
Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you much.
Take care, everybody. Stay well.
You as well.
Take care.
Thank you.
So why don't we take a short break and we'll come back and I know it'll be anticlimactic after having the greatest maritime historian of his generation with us, but we'll come back and see where we can go for the next few minutes, okay? Okay, so I gave you both each a document that actually talks about the same event, and I didn't give you any context for it. I don't know if I should have. Why don't you tell us what you found? Why don't we start with Megan, Sean, and Ray's group? Let's see what they discerned from this.
To be honest, I have no idea what he was talking about, but he is very descriptive in using like of the time sea talk. Like he talks about the sea god Neptune and his trident, and how there was a part in the second page that the guy, like someone's face was like stripped bare of all the skin and like stuff like that. So maybe it's a battle. I have no idea. It's
okay. Let me see. Then how about, let's see, Sarah, Trevor, Mike. Well, you see, you had an advantage. The second group was reading the handwritten journal of Midshipman Washington P. Buckner. He went by William Buckner, I guess, later on. And he kept this journal as a midshipman. The other group had the typewritten journal of, he didn't type this, someone transcribed it, of John B. Dale, who was a lieutenant. And what did you get out of it?
We kind of had a similar experience to what Sean described. The context, without having context, it was a little bit difficult to decipher what exactly was going on in his journal entries. But there was also, like Sean mentioned, there was mention of Neptune and the sea gods and a lot of stuff that maybe we had perceived to be mythical. And it talks about their voyage down to Rio. So that is what I took away from it.
Okay.
And all their excursions.
Now, did either of you see a date on the document? Do you know when this was?
I
have August 1844, I believe.
Okay, that's the end. Okay.
Yeah, it goes from June to August.
June to August. Okay, so this is an event at sea when a ship crosses the equator, and there is a ceremony, and it's now kind of, even here, Dale is saying the ceremony's kind of gone out of fashion. And each one is describing this, where people who have never crossed the equator before have to be initiated by Neptune into the fraternity of people who have crossed the equator, who have been in Neptune's dominion. So the first piece of the episode, actually on the 23rd of July, 1844, Dale writes, "The crew has been in a great excitement for the last few days on account of the visit of old Neptune, expected to take place on the line." The line is the equator. "This is an old custom fast becoming obsolete. The men always manifest the most profound interest in such frolics, the old salt spinning very wonderful yarns on the occasions of the greenhorn. At 8 o'clock this evening, light ho was sung out from the bows, and soon after the ship was regularly hailed by Father Neptune, who, although somewhere about the bowsprit, was to be imagined as approaching from the distance. He sent on board his messenger by the lee gangway, where instead of seeing a stalwart Triton covered with seaweed and dripping with brine, a little forecastle man by the name of Fitzgerald was rigged out more like a North American Indian than a sea god. Indeed, it was a laughable burlesque, for our little old forecastle man, with his wiry legs developed beneath his white sheeting's wrapper, which he drew around in a tragedy style and with a paper cap on his head, had lost his presence of mind and forgotten his part. However, he managed to deliver a letter to the officer of the deck from Neptune to Captain Percival, an old acquaintance, welcoming him back once more to his dominions, requesting the names of such of his children as had never been initiated, and also permission to come on board tomorrow morning. This was graciously accorded by the captain with an appropriate speech when old Neptune was again heard hailing for his postman. They both then disappeared over the bows and were supposed to go off in a half barrel of tarred rope in a flame, half tarred rope yarns in a flame, which slowly floated astern and continued to burn for a mile or two. This is the commencement of the farce, and tomorrow we'll see its consummation. So, is that clear? That you have, as they're crossing the line, you have this ceremony, and it starts with Neptune, asking permission to come aboard. And so they cross the line during the night, and at 9 in the morning, taking the light sails, and old Neptune soon after hailed us and was seen coming aft in the weather gangway in a triumphal car, a mess chest mounted on trucks, drawn by 4 seahorses, 4 Negroes painted with red streaks across the face and naked from the waist upwards, with Amphitrite seated by his side, and 1 or 2 boys dressed very queenly, but whether they were to represent male or female gods was very doubtful, accompanied by Tritons and constables with long spears and oakum beards. And what do you make of this scene aboard the ship?
It's very, it seems like ancient, like it seems so ritualistic. It seems pagan. Like, it's very cool. It's like it's just,
It's different.
I would not assume this would happen on a United States vessel.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find anything from in Buckner's journal. He has the same thing about, his description of the first is, soon after nightfall, we heard a hoarse voice hailing the ship, and directly afterwards, a man in a strange attire, looking something like a half fish, came aft with a document for the captain. Mr. Wise and family were on deck, and their little daughter ran below, crying out frightened, "Oh, mercy, Nipkins is on board." So Henry Wise is the American ambassador to Brazil they're carrying, and he and his wife and daughter are on board when this half fish comes aboard and the little girl runs below. The captain, after treated the messenger to a glass of wine, which he, the sea monster, smacked his lips at and appeared to enjoy as much as any human could. The captain then told him that he should be very happy to see Father Neptune, the powerful god of the seas, that they had once been old friends, and he knew he would not forget him. With this, the messenger departed, and soon was seen a blaze of fire on her starboard quarter, which the tar said was his boat. So they have this barrel that they've lit on fire, and that is Neptune's boat, which they then cast off. Okay, so it is, as Sean said, really a ritual that they are doing. And the Neptune Company had been preparing themselves for 8 or 10 days, and all that was now wanting was a place for a barber shop. The armorers and carpenters had constructed some 8 or 10 razors that would fairly make a New York dandy faint. And let me see if we have a description of the barbers here. in Dale's journal, the barbers too performed their part in the strange procession, flourishing their razors made of hoop iron, a foot or two in length. So they have barbers. And did anyone get to what the barbers do and what the barber shop is? Well, let's see. Here was a platform raised and the starboard gangway occupied by a large tarpaulin triced up so as to hold water. The hose of the forcing pump was led to it and the carpenter set to pumping. A band of oakum bearded constables came. By the way, what is an oakum bearded constable?
What's that first word?
Oakum.
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 Is it?
See, this is the downside of not reading Melville, because there's a lot about oakum in Moby Dick.
Is it like some sort of seaweed?
No. Oakum is it's actually kind of the lint you get by picking old rope and old garments. So, and then you use oakum to caulk the ship. So oakum, it's a fine fiber. Well, fine fiber that you actually get out of rags. Okay, so what is an oakum beard?
Is it a fake beard?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a beard made out of oakum. Okay, good. Now I can see why this was so painful for you to read, because it's, I should have kept this when you kept Professor Fowler here. He probably would have enjoyed this. And you'll think, boy, someone would enjoy this. Okay, so they have these oakum bearded constables came aft with a list of names, the names of the people who had not yet crossed the equator. And first pounced upon the lieutenant of Marines, who walked off with them most manfully. Soon he was seen, stripped of his coat, seated on the platform with his back to the tarpaulin reservoir of water, with the grotesque barbers flourishing in the air their huge razors and lather brushes. Many of them wore masks of canvas with painted faces, producing a hideous effect. And there sat old Neptune in state, with his white flowing beard, red robes, paper crown, and in place of his trident, a dolphin on a staff. Screams of laughter echoed from everybody as they proceeded with different individuals, excusing none but the females, the sick, and Mr. Wise, who got off by making a stump speech on the Jacob's Ladder. And Wise, remember, had been a member of Congress, so he's used to giving speeches, in which he claimed as an ambassador privilege of free transit through neutral territories agreeable to the law of nations, offering at the same time to substitute all his children, his secretary, and his servants for the ordeal, adding some spirited promises, which probably was the most forcible argument he could have used. What are spirited promises, do you think?
He was drunk.
I don't think he was. That's right. Spirited promise.
Very forceful, promises.
Well, spirited is underlined.
Oh, when you say spirited, I would have thought, he was drunk if you hadn't said he wasn't, but spirited spirits, like
spirits. Yeah, he's promising them spirits. Okay, yeah. So he's going to get off. Okay. In which fast as the neophytes were lathered with soap suds and coal dust. So they're being shaved with lather and coal dust, and shaved by these rough barbers with their rasping razors with edges like saws. They were capsized over backwards into the water, where they were received by 4 tritons, the biggest, blackest, half-naked, woolly-headed tritons, who soused them under, washed them over, and held them for the engine hose to play on till they made their escape, half dead and half drowned by such rude handling. Many were refractory and ran aloft, where they were caught up by the unrelenting constables and lowered down by a bowline, only to get rougher treatment than the others. No place was sacred. A party came down to the purser's room, where he was engaged writing. He was obliged to put by his ledgers and go through the ordeal. By the way, do you know who the purser is?
He handles like letters and such.
Yeah, well, not necessarily letters.
And like valuables.
Trevor, you were nodding your head.
It's like a banker, right?
The banker, yeah, he's the guy in charge of the money on the ship. Okay.
Oh,
The reefers were shaved and soused in the most unconscionable manner. The reefers are the midship. One of Mr. Wise's boys was very refractory, but a drummer boy, taking him by the head and shoulders, while another boy, both rigged out like imps, took him by the heels, lugged him up to the dreaded platform. The spirit of fun was now ripe. Shouts of laughter resounded from all parts of the ship. Little byplays were going on, very ludicrous in themselves, especially on an occasion when everybody was disposed to laugh. After 2 hours, the boatswain piped belay. However, it was closed by it. So this goes on for 2 hours. The people who have not crossed the equator are being initiated in this ritual, and people are trying to escape, but they're dragged back. Think of that. Henry Weiss is the American ambassador to Brazil, and his kid, he has a plantation in Virginia, and his son is trying to escape, but 2 boys who are, young guys, maybe teenagers on the ship, maybe his age or younger, are grabbing him. Just think about the social status of these people and what's going on. And you have the black guys on the ship acting as they're ducking these guys underwater. People like the lieutenant of the Marines or the ship's purser. So it's an extraordinary ritual. However, it was closed by a scene not soon to be forgotten. The captain, among others, had mounted on the boats amidships to see the fun. When some of the midshipmen got hold of the hose, pointing at some particular person. Okay, so you have this hose that's been pumping water into this thing. The midshipmen take the hose, they're pointing it at someone. And in the melee which occurred, our veteran captain received a full charge from the force pump. And there was such a scramble to get off the boats that some came off coatless or tailless and all looked like drowned rats. So what do you suppose would happen typically on a Navy ship when there's this horseplay going on and the captain gets drenched with water? The captain, who's an old crotchety guy. Yes, Trevor.
They'd run away so they don't get caught.
You'd think they'd run away so they don't get caught. You'd think there's going to be big trouble now because now you've got the captain all wet. The captain laughed as heartily as any of them, with his yellow nankeens clinging close to his legs, the gray head drenched with water. So that's not what happens. The captain takes this all as this fun ritual. And again, I think in some ways the handwritten one is more interesting or as interesting. I don't know if anyone picked up any. Does this make more sense now what's going on? So why do they do this? Let's see.
I think it's a celebration of sorts.
It is.
Celebrate
yes.
your first equator crossing.
Yes.
Because it's a big milestone.
It is.
You're going far away from home.
That's very true. Let me see. And this is Buckner's journal. In the morning watch, our boom cover was swung in the lee gangway. A throne was erected just forward of the fore rigging for Neptune. The engine being rigged, the boom cover was filled with water. A bench for the barbers. At 9, the band struck up a grand march, and Neptune with his guards came aft. Neptune himself on a carriage, pulled by 6 black Negroes. These Negroes were bare down to the waist and had red stripes, scales painted on them. Then came the guards, each with a long flowing robes and with long white hair or beard, and as old apparently as if it had been growing thousands of years. Then Neptune with his trident and with a crown, looking more like a devil than a god. The guards were each armed with a harpoon. Then came the barbers, each with their shaving brush as stiff as could be, and with their razors. After Neptune had shaken hands with the captain and bowed to the ladies, he was treated with a glass of grog by the captain. And also at the same time, he, the captain, ordered that Neptune should have command for the day. So Percival turns over command of the ship to Neptune. And Neptune is, do we know who Neptune is?
He's the god of the sea, correct?
He is the god of the sea, but who is this Neptune that there? You were saying earlier, Sarah, you didn't believe that Neptune existed, but apparently here is Neptune on the ship. And so I'm wondering, is this the god of the sea who's come aboard the ship?
It's somebody dressed up as Neptune.
It's somebody, and do we know who it is? according to the Dale, it's an old forecastle man. Okay. So it was an ordinary sailor, but now the captain's turning over command of the ship to them. Okay. Then commenced the sport. The first one taken was the carpenter, a fellow that was not liked by the men. They placed him up on the bench, scraped nearly all the skin off his face, and upset him backwards in the water, where he was met by 3 big Negroes who ducked him and held him so that the engine would play full in his face. The poor fellow was near drowned when he was let loose. Next came the lieutenant of Marines. He was a fat man, about 200 pounds or more. They shaved him as usual, upset him, where he was met by the Negroes who served him almost as bad as the carpenter. So you have the carpenter, who's a petty officer, and he says he's not well liked. And then you have the lieutenant of the Marines. He's also someone who is in charge, and they're being held under the water. The next one caught was myself. The barbers rasped my face with their iron hoops most unmercifully, and then almost blinded me with stuff called lather, made of ashes, lampblack, grease, and salt water. And if I should open my mouth to take in a breath, in went a brush. And when half blind and half smothered, they upset me into the water, which was about 4 feet deep, where I was most unmercifully ducked, or as it is called, washed off, with the engine playing full in my face, and no way to get rid of it. After half drowning me, I was let off. Went below and changed clothes, determined to enjoy the fun. The worst of all, this was that the Mr. Wise, with their pretty daughter, was up in the horsebuck laughing to kill themselves. So here, he's a midshipman, he's a young guy, and he sees the Wises and their daughter laughing at him being this ritual humiliation. By the way, Professor Fowler and Carl and I discussed doing something similar with the class to initiate all of you, but the dean said no, they didn't give permission for that particular exercise. After I had been served in this way, and some 6 or 8 others in the same way, and some even worse if possible, Neptune's guards then secured the purser, who kicked and scuffed, but was no use. They shaved, ducked, and washed the poor fellow till he would not speak. Then came about 150 men who were shaved after this. So it's like 160 people getting shaved and initiated in this ritual. A party of midshipmen got up a plan to shave Neptune himself and a few others. It commenced on the boom cover by someone taking the hose and spouting it in his face. So Buckner's a midshipman, so he knows what the midshipmen are doing. Dale just thought the midshipmen somehow got the hose, but they're actually trying to get Neptune. Another took the bucket of lather and hove it over old Neptune, who had to run for it. The captain attempted to interfere, but was badly ducked as anyone. At the close, there was about 10 midshipmen were in the water, 20 old sailors, and a Philadelphia inquisite. Mr. Wise section almost all drowned, and Mr. Wise's son, secretary, almost all drowned, and his dignity most outrageously insulted. The noise and laughter, the splashing of water, the half-strangled oath of some poor fellow as the engine played in his face, the dirty faces of the scufflers, the uncouth figures of Neptune's barbers, made this one of the most laughable scenes I ever witnessed. After it was all over, I found that I had suffered more than anyone else. My coat was split up the back, one tail torn off, my shirt ripped off my back, and one leg of my pants torn off above the knee. Mr. Wise and family appeared to enjoy the fun more than anyone else, and when they caught a sight of me as I dove down the hatch, I heard the clear laugh of Mr. Wise's pretty daughter, who called to her mother, to look, but 'twas too late. So it really gets him that Mr. Wise's pretty daughter really thinks this is funny. Okay. I was out of sight when nearly everyone on board had been ducked on some way or another. The captain ordered the boatswain to call all hands and splice the main brace, which was done. A good dinner was given in the cabin. Okay, so anyone know what splicing the main brace is?
I know what splicing is. I forget the word. The main brace, you said?
Splice the main brace, a nautical term. It's actually the captain here to splice the main brace. You're right. There is a nautical term for splicing where you're and a brace is a piece of line, but splicing the main brace is actually being served a ration of grog. And grog is water, rum, and sugar, which are mixed together because at this time there was a daily ration of grog, but the grog you're not going to get a daily ration of rum because then there might be a tendency for you to hoard it and save it until you have enough and then you can get drunk. This is just a daily thing. So they mix it with water and sugar so it won't keep. But it's a treat to get an extra ration of grog. So at the end of all of this, when you have these sailors shaving superior officers, getting the captain drenched, and you then have everyone gets a ration of grog.
Question, Professor.
Yes, Ray.
You said if grog was mixed so it wouldn't keep long, like once it was taken out of the cask, I presume, then would it, like if it was, kept sealed up, would it keep for an entire journey, you said?
No, they have barrels of rum and barrels of whiskey aboard, so they mix it to order. And so everyone gets the ration of grog. Mm. The Constitution Museum still, by the way, yesterday was their 45th anniversary, and they traditionally have grog toasts at these kinds of occasions. So, and by the way, at this time, there's also an issue in the 1840s. There's an issue in the Navy, an attempt to ban grog, because it leads to, they think, drunkenness. And one of the biggest things sailors will be punished for is drunkenness. So why are we encouraging them to drink? Well, anyway, I guess we can continue talking about this and other rituals next time. And let's see, I need to review the syllabus because we did have an assignment to profile a sailor, but I'm not quite sure if that is, Megan, you're nodding your head. Yes, are you on that? Have you already done that, or are you waiting?
I just need to record my voice over it and turn it in.
Okay. So we can talk more. I'll send out more instructions this week on that. So we'll delay the actual due date until next Friday, when we'll also have a chance to discuss leadership and what makes a good leader. Okay. So I think that's enough for this week. Although I'm just starting to warm up, but it's good to see you all, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Sounds good. So we should expect an email with the instructions for the crew profiles.
Yes, Mike. Thanks for asking.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Good. Take care. Yes.
I have had trouble uploading one of my videos.
Uh-oh.
Said that it was beyond the maximum size